"Buy her, not me," the black girl begged, and the mountain man paid double, and took both. On a dusty frontier street, the crowd jeered as two sisters stood to be sold like cattle. One begged for her sister's life, ready to sacrifice her own. And then, boots thundered on the boards, silver hit the table, and a mountain man's voice cut through the laughter. "I'll take them both." But what seemed like mercy sparked a storm of hate. The town doctor slammed the door in their faces. A rancher waved forged papers, swearing the girls were his property. And when night fell, the mountain man was beaten, chained in the jailhouse, while the sisters were dragged away. Whispers filled the saloon, the church bell tolled, and the judge's gavel thundered. Was redemption truly bought? Or will corruption tear this new family apart? And in a land where mercy costs more than bullets, who will stand when the truth comes to light? Every story brings us a little closer together. Before we dive in, drop a comment with where you're tuning in from. It's a joy to see how far this family of listeners reaches. The February wind cut sharp across the auction yard, carrying the bite of mountain snow. Lanterns cast harsh shadows across weathered faces as townsfolk pressed closer, their breath frosting in the evening air. On the wooden platform, 17-year-old Abby stood straight-backed despite her threadbare dress, one arm protectively around her younger sister, Louisa. Rancher Turner swaggered across the planks, his boots thundering with each step. "Two field hands here," he announced, voice thick with whiskey. "Owed wages and board these past 6 months." He yanked a wrinkled paper from his vest. "Legal documents show the debt clear as day." Abby's fingers tightened on Louisa's shoulder as her sister swayed, burning with fever. The 14-year-old's face was pale as milk, her mixed heritage showing plain in the lamplight. A cough racked her thin frame. "Buy her, not me!" Abby's voice rang out sudden and clear, splitting the winter air. "Please, she needs medicine, proper care." Her dark eyes flashed with desperate courage. "I can work anywhere, but she won't last in the fields." Cruel laughter rippled through the crowd. A few men in the front row elbowed each other, calling out mocking bids. $2 for the sick one. Make it $3 if she comes with a blanket." Turner's face twisted in a yellow-toothed grin as he raised the gavel. "Going once for $3. The sharp ring of silver on wood cut through the jeers. Louis Hale stood at the edge of the platform, his presence as solid as the mountains themselves. Weather-creased face stern beneath his wide-brimmed hat, he counted out coins from a leather pouch. $20 in silver, he said, voice quiet but carrying. For both. A shocked murmur swept the yard. Turner's grin faltered as he counted the stack twice. That's double the asking price. Then we have a deal. Luis's words held no room for argument. He climbed the steps, movements deliberate as he shrugged off his buffalo coat. With gentle hands, he wrapped it around Louisa's trembling shoulders. The familiar scent of wood smoke and pine needles enveloped the girl as Louis guided both sisters down the steps. Abby's legs shook, the reality of their salvation not yet sinking in. She stumbled, but Louis's steady hand caught her elbow. "Easy now," he murmured. "You're safe." Behind them, the crowd's whispers grew pointed as knives. "Fool's gone soft in the head." Waste of good silver? Mountain air must have addled his mind. Louis ignored them all, leading the sisters toward the street where evening lamps cast pools of golden light. Louisa coughed again, and he tucked the coat tighter around her. "My cabin's a few miles out," he said. "Can you both ride?" Abby nodded, though her eyes held wary questions. She'd seen too many men's kindness turn cruel. "Why?" she asked simply. Louis paused, considering his words carefully. "Because it needed doing," he said at last, "and because no child should be sold like cattle." Fresh tears spilled down Abby's cheeks, but she wiped them away quickly. "Much obliged, sir. We'll work hard, earn our keep." We'll sort all that later. Louis led them to where his horse waited, its breath steaming in the cold. First, let's get your sister warm. As he helped them mount, more townsfolk gathered to stare. Some shook their heads in disapproval, others whispered behind raised hands. But Louis paid them no mind as he took the reins, leading his horse and its precious cargo away from the auction yard's harsh lantern light. In that moment, something shifted between the weathered mountain man and the two sisters he'd saved. Trust, fragile as morning frost, began to form. None of them could know how this night would bind their lives together, or how Louisa's simple act of mercy would echo through the days to come. The evening wind still bit cold, but wrapped in Louisa's buffalo coat, Louisa's shivering eased. Abby sat tall behind her sister, one arm steady around her waist, and Louisa's boots marked a steady rhythm on the packed earth, leading them away from cruelty and toward whatever tomorrow might bring. The wagon wheels creaked and jolted over the rutted road, each bump making Louisa wince beneath her borrowed blanket. Stars pierced the ink-black sky like pinpricks in velvet, their cold light washing the mountain slopes in silver. Louis held the reins with practiced ease, guiding his team around the worst of the holes with gentle clicks of his tongue. Abby sat rigid beside him on the wooden seat, one arm wrapped tight around her sister. Her other hand gripped the wagon's edge, knuckles white against the rough wood. Every few minutes, her dark eyes darted sideways, studying their rescuer's weathered profile. "Pine Ridge lies yonder," Louis said, breaking the stillness. He pointed toward a dark line of trees etched against the starlit sky. "Cabin's just beyond, where you see that yellow light." A warm glow flickered in the distance, barely visible through the trees. Louisa coughed, the sound rattling deep in her chest. Abby pulled her closer, tucking the buffalo coat more securely around her shoulders. "She needs warmth," Louis said quietly. His voice carried on the night wind, gentle as falling snow, and proper rest. "Why are you helping us?" Abby's question came sharp and sudden as breaking glass. Louis was silent for several long moments, only the creak of harness leather and the steady clip of hooves marking time. When he finally spoke, his words seemed drawn from some deep well of memory. "Had a daughter once," he said. "About your sister's age." His hands tightened slightly on the reins. "Buried her and her mama both. 5 winters passed. Fever took them quick, before the doctor could ride out." Abby's rigid posture softened slightly, but wariness still shadowed her eyes. The wagon rounded a bend, and Louisa's cabin came into full view. It was a modest structure of solid logs, with a stone chimney reaching toward the stars. Smoke curled from its top, speaking of warmth within. A small barn stood off to one side, its weather-grayed boards silvered by starlight. Louis helped them down from the wagon, supporting Louisa's weight as Abby jumped to the ground. Inside, a lamp burned low on a simple table set with tin plates and cups. Shelves lined one wall, holding sacks of dried beans and flour. The stone hearth glowed with banked coals, their heat already warming the single room. "Let's get her settled," Louis said, nodding toward a bed built into one corner. Clean quilts were piled high, their patterns barely visible in the dim light. Together they helped Louisa lie down, her face flushed with fever against the white pillowcase. Louis moved to the hearth, hanging a kettle over the flames. "Tea will help," he said, stirring the coals to life. "Got some bread too, baked fresh yesterday. You both need food in you." While the water heated, Abby perched on the edge of Louisa's bed, smoothing her sister's hair back from her forehead. Outside, coyotes began their nightly chorus, their wild voices rising and falling in the darkness. "Thank you," Abby whispered, the words barely audible above the kettle's growing song. But when Louise turned to meet her gaze, doubt still lingered in her eyes, deep as mountain shadows. He saw it and understood. Too many had proved false before him. Louis simply nodded and turned back to his task, measuring dried herbs into cups with careful hands. The cabin, though small, wrapped around them like a warm blanket after the biting wind and jeering crowd of town. As Louis passed Abby a steaming cup and a thick slice of bread, something shifted in the lamplight. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the first seedling of hope, as fragile as spring's earliest buds. Louisa's breathing eased as she sipped the hot tea, her fingers curled around the tin cup. The fire's glow caught the silver threading through Louis's dark hair as he settled into a chair, his own cup warming his hands. For now, at least, they were safe. The night pressed close against the window panes, but here within these log walls, humiliation gave way to the possibility of shelter. The cabin settled into midnight stillness, broken only by the soft pop and crackle of burning pine logs. Louisa had drifted into uneasy sleep hours ago, while Abby kept watch from a wooden chair pulled close to the bed. Louis dozed in his rocker by the hearth, his worn boots stretched toward the warmth. A restless movement from the bed caught Abby's attention. Louisa tossed against the quilts, her nightdress clinging to damp skin. When Abby touched her sister's forehead, fear clutched at her heart. Louisa's skin burned like sun-heated stone. "Louisa, wake up, sister." Abby's voice trembled as she shook the girl's shoulder. "Please wake up." Louis was beside them in an instant, moving with the quiet sureness of long habit. He pressed his palm to Louisa's forehead, his weathered face grave in the firelight. "Fever's taken hold," he said softly. "Breathing's too quick and shallow." Abby's composure cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she gripped Louisa's limp hand. "This is why," she choked out, "why I begged you not to buy me at the auction. I could have survived whatever came, worked in the mines, cleaned houses, anything. But Louisa," her voice broke. "She's too fragile. The cold, the hunger, it would kill her." Louis knelt beside the bed, his eyes kind. "You chose rightly, girl." Speaking up for her like that showed real courage. He squeezed her shoulder gently. "Now let's tend to her proper." He moved with quiet efficiency, setting water to boil and gathering supplies from his shelves. Soon the cabin filled with the sharp green scent of willow bark steeping in hot water. Louis wrung out cool cloths in a basin of well water, showing Abby how to wipe Louisa's face and neck. Outside, snow began falling in thick, silent flakes. The soft white curtain muted the forest sounds, wrapping the cabin in a cocoon of stillness. Hours crept by like molasses in winter. The fever held Louisa in its grip, bringing no relief despite their careful ministrations. Abby dipped another cloth in the cooling water, her hands trembling with exhaustion. Fighting to keep despair from her voice, she began to sing softly, a hymn their mother had taught them in better days. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound! That saved a wretch like me." Her clear voice filled the cabin, steady despite her fears. Louis paused in his work, the familiar melody tugging at old wounds. He saw another sickbed, another young girl burning with fever, while his wife sang this very hymn. The memory rose sharp as a knife blade, then settled back into its familiar ache. The eastern window began to lighten, dawn seeping through the glass in pearly gray light. Louisa stirred, her breathing easier for the first time in hours. When Louis checked her forehead, the burning heat had lessened slightly. "The fever's breaking," he murmured. "Just for now, mind you. It might come back. But it's a good sign." Abby sagged with relief, laying her head on the quilt beside her sister. Her eyes drifted closed despite her efforts to stay alert. Louis draped a blanket over her shoulders, then settled back into his chair to keep watch. In the growing light, he studied the two girls, one dark, one fair, both carrying more burden than their young shoulders should bear. His lips moved in a whisper, forming words he hadn't spoken since that other bitter night 5 years ago. "Lord, I ain't been much for talking to you lately. But these children need your help something fierce, See them through this night. Please." The snow continued falling outside the frosted window panes, and the fire burned low in the hearth. Louise reached for another log, ready to face whatever the new day might bring. Morning light glinted off fresh snow as Louise stepped onto his cabin's porch. The pristine white blanket stretched unbroken to the tree line, except for the dark tracks of deer that had passed in the night. His breath fogged in the crisp air while he adjusted the harness on his old mule, the leather creaking in the cold. Inside the cabin, Abby wrapped Louisa in every quilt they could spare. The fever had ebbed but hadn't broken completely, leaving Louisa pale and weak. Her eyes were glassy as Abby helped her towards the wagon. "Easy now," Louise said, lifting Louisa as gently as he would handle a newborn lamb. He settled her in the wagon bed, where Abby had arranged blankets and straw for cushioning. Abby climbed in beside her sister, tucking the covers tight against the biting wind. The wagon wheels crunched through the fresh snow as they set out. Louise kept the pace steady, mindful of every bump that might jar Louisa. The town emerged from the white landscape after an hour's careful travel, smoke rising from chimneys, horses stamping in front of the general store, women hurrying along the boardwalks with shawls pulled tight. Louise pulled up in front of the doctor's office, a narrow building wedged between the mercantile and the barber shop. The brass plate on the door read, "Dr. William Morton," in fancy lettering. Inside, the waiting room smelled of carbolic acid and tobacco. The doctor emerged from his back office, wiping his hands on a cloth. He was a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a neat mustache. His eyes narrowed at the sight of Abby, then moved to Louisa in the doorway, supported between Louise and her sister. "Well?" Dr. Morton's voice held the same edge as his spectacles. "What's all this, then?" "The girl's sick with fever," Louise explained. "Been burning up since midnight. Needs proper medicine." The doctor stepped closer, barely glancing at Louisa before his lip curled. "Mixed stock, ain't they? Heard about your purchase at yesterday's auction." He turned away, arranging bottles on a nearby shelf. "Don't waste my time or your money, Hale. These kinds aren't worth the powder to treat them." Louisa's hands clenched into fists. "A sick child is a sick child. I can pay." "That's not the point." Morton's voice grew sharp. "Those girls are property, legally sold at auction for debt. Far as I'm concerned, you've got no right to them. Should report this to the sheriff right now." Heat rose in Louisa's chest, a familiar rage he hadn't felt in years. One step brought him toe-to-toe with the doctor. "You threatening me?" "Louise, please." Abby's fingers clutched his sleeve. Her voice trembled but held firm. "Don't start trouble." "Not here. Not now." The doctor's hand moved toward the bell on his desk, the one that would summon the sheriff from his office next door. Louise forced his fingers to unclench, though his jaw remained tight as a trap. "Come on," he growled, turning towards the door. "We'll find another way." They helped Louisa back to the wagon, whispers following them down the street. Women pulled their children closer as they passed. Men stopped their conversations to stare. Louise climbed onto the wagon seat, his movements stiff with contained anger. The return journey stretched longer than the morning's ride. The sun climbed high, then began its slow descent behind the mountains. Louisa dozed fitfully, while Abby sang quiet hymns to soothe her. Louise broke the silence as they crested the last hill before his cabin. "I want you to know something," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "What happened back there, that ain't right, and I won't abandon you to it." His knuckles whitened on the reins. "That town don't get to decide your fate, not while I draw breath." Abby's eyes shone with tears, but she straightened her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered, "for standing up for us. For caring at all." The cabin appeared ahead, smoke curling from its chimney where they'd banked the morning's fire. Louise helped carry Louisa inside while Abby built up the flames. When the room was warm, Louise retrieved a worn leather pouch from a high shelf. "My wife," he said softly, untying the strings. She learned about healing herbs from her grandmother. Taught me some before. He cleared his throat. These might help. He laid out small bundles of dried leaves and flowers on the table. With patient care, he showed Abby how to make poultices, yarrow for the fever, mullein for the cough that rattled in Louisa's chest. Together they worked in the firelight, beginning their own quiet battle against the sickness that gripped the young girl. The storm moved in like a white curtain, erasing the world beyond the cabin windows. Snow fell in thick, silent flakes, piling against the doorstep and coating the pine branches until they sagged under the weight. Inside, the cabin became their whole universe, a place of waiting, working, and prayer. Each morning before dawn, Louis pulled on his heavy coat and stepped into the biting cold. His boots crunched through fresh snow to the woodpile, where he swung his axe with steady rhythm. The sharp crack of splitting wood echoed across the white landscape, and his breath rose in clouds as he worked. He carried armload after armload to stack by the hearth, determined to keep the fire fed. Abby moved like a shadow through the cabin, her steps quiet but sure. She stirred the soup pot hanging over the flames, adding pinches of dried herbs that filled the air with their sharp, clean scent. Between spoonfuls of broth fed to Louisa, she learned Louisa's simple remedies, wisdom passed down through years of frontier living. Cedar tea helps clear the chest, Louis explained, showing her how to steep the fresh needles. His weathered hands moved with gentle precision as he measured the portions. My Emma, my wife, she learned that from old Ms. Walker down in the valley. Abby nodded, memorizing each detail. When Louis demonstrated how to make sage compresses, she watched intently, then copied his movements exactly. Her hands were steady as she laid the warm cloths across Louisa's forehead. The hours between treatments found Abby shouldering her share of the work without complaint. She split kindling with the same determination she showed in everything else, the axe looking too big in her slender hands, but striking true nonetheless. Louise watched from the doorway as she hauled water from the well, her boots leaving deep tracks in the snow. Pride tugged at his heart. Not that he'd say it aloud. Nights were the hardest. Louisa's breathing would grow labored in the dark hours, each shallow gasp setting them all on edge. Abby sat beside her sister's bed, her voice rising soft and clear in hymns their mother had taught them. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. The familiar words filled the cabin, weaving through the crackle of the fire and the whisper of wind outside. Louis settled into his rocking chair, his pipe cold and forgotten in his hands. The songs carried him back to Sunday mornings long ago. Emma in her best dress, their little Sarah bouncing on his knee as church bells rang across the valley. He hadn't set foot in a church since burying them, but Abby's voice stirred something in his soul that he'd thought was dead. On the third night, change came like the first breath of spring. Louisa's eyes opened clearer than they had been in days. She pushed herself up against the pillows, weak but alert. Hungry, she whispered. Abby nearly dropped the bowl she was holding. Louisa? Her voice cracked. She rushed to her sister's side, touching her forehead. The fever had broken. Louise brought over the soup pot, ladling out a small portion. They watched as Louisa lifted the spoon herself, managing several slow sips before her strength ebbed. But it was enough, more than enough. Abby's tears came suddenly, mixing with laughter that bubbled up from deep inside her. She grabbed Louisa's hand, pressing it to her cheek. Thank you, Lord, she breathed. Thank you, thank you! Louis stood back, his own eyes burning as he bowed his head. The Lord is merciful, he murmured, the words rusty but sincere. His gaze moved from Louisa to Abby, then around the cabin that no longer felt empty. Something had changed in these 3 days. The wariness that had marked their first hours together had softened, like snow melting in sunshine. Where there had been silence, now there were hymns, Where there had been empty chairs, now there was family. It was fragile as a seedling pushing through winter earth, but it was growing stronger with each passing hour. Abby caught his eye and smiled, a real smile, not the guarded expression she'd worn before. "Much obliged, Mr. Hale," she said softly. "For everything." Luis nodded, his throat too tight for words. He added another log to the fire, watching the flames leap up bright and strong. Outside, snow continued to fall, but inside the cabin spring had already begun to bloom. The morning sun glinted off fresh snow as Luis hitched the mule to his wagon. A week had passed since Louisa's fever broke, and her strength grew with each bowl of soup. But their supplies were running low, forcing a return to town. "I'm coming with you," Abby announced, wrapping her shawl tighter, her chin lifted in that familiar, determined way. "You'll need help loading supplies, and I aim to earn my keep." Luis studied her face, seeing the same fire that had kept her sister alive. "Reckon I could use the help," he said finally, offering his hand to help her up to the wagon seat. Inside, Louisa sat propped against pillows, color finally returning to her cheeks. "I'll be fine," she assured them. "Got enough wood for the fire and soup warming on the hearth." The wagon wheels creaked as they rolled down the mountain trail. Abby sat straight-backed beside Luis, her eyes fixed ahead. The town appeared through the trees, a collection of wooden buildings dusted with snow, smoke rising from chimneys into the cold air. At the general store, Luis helped Abby down from the wagon. The bell jingled as they entered, and conversation died. Men lounged against the counter, their eyes following the pair as Luis began selecting supplies: flour, coffee, sugar, dried beans. "Mighty expensive feeding strays," one man drawled, loud enough to carry. Another spat tobacco juice into a brass spittoon. "Heard Telly paid double price for them cast-offs. More money than sense, I reckon." Abby's hands trembled slightly as she examined a bolt of cloth, but she held her head high. Luis moved deliberately, adding matches and lamp oil to their pile of goods. The door burst open with a bang. Rancher Turner stormed in, his face flushed with drink despite the early hour. "There you are, you thieving mountain rat," he shouted at Luis. "You cheated me fair and square." Luis turned slowly, his voice level. "Paid double your asking price, Turner. Every man there saw it." "Don't matter none," Turner snarled. "Them girls is my property. I got papers saying so, and I want them back." His hand slapped against the counter, making the candy jars rattle. The store grew silent as a grave. Luis's right hand drifted to the revolver at his hip, but before he could speak, Abby stepped forward. Her voice rang clear and strong through the store. "We are not your stock." Turner's face twisted. "You uppity little—" "You sold us," Abby continued, her words sharp as icicles. "Mr. Hale paid honest coin. We belong to ourselves now." The rancher's hand clenched into a fist. "We'll see what the law has to say about that. I'll have the deputy out there tomorrow." He stormed toward the door, then turned back. "And you'll regret this, Hale. Mark my words." The door slammed behind him. Luis quickly paid for their supplies while the other men watched, their faces dark with barely hidden malice. They loaded the wagon in tense silence and headed home, the mule's hooves crunching through snow. As the town disappeared behind them, Abby finally spoke. "Will the law side with him?" Luis sighed, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Deputy Briggs drinks with Turner most nights, takes his money at poker too." He glanced at her worried face. "But that don't make him right. We'll face whatever comes together." The sun was setting by the time they reached the cabin. Louisa sat up eagerly as they entered, but her smile faded when she saw their expressions. Abby explained what had happened while Luis built up the fire. "What'll we do?" Louisa whispered, clutching her quilt. "We'll stand our ground," Luis said firmly, settling into his chair. "The Lord didn't lead us this far to abandon us now." Outside, snow began falling again, thick flakes swirling in the gathering dark. The fire crackled warmly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. But all three knew that beyond their circle of light, hatred was gathering like storm clouds. Turner's threats hung in the air, heavy as the snow-laden branches outside their window. Abby moved to stir the soup pot, her movements precise and controlled. But Louise saw how her hands shook slightly, saw the fear she was trying to hide from her sister. When she passed him a bowl of soup, he caught her eye. "Together," he said quietly. "Whatever comes." She nodded, drawing a deep breath. The fire popped and hissed, throwing sparks up the chimney. They ate their supper in thoughtful silence, each one preparing in their own way for the battle that lay ahead. January stretched into February, each day bringing small victories in their isolated cabin. The morning sun found Louisa sitting at the wooden table, her fingers carefully peeling potatoes while color bloomed in her once pale cheeks. She hummed softly, the same hymns that had comforted her during fever nights. "You're getting stronger every day," Abby said, smiling as she watched her sister work. The change in Louisa brought joy to her heart. Gone was the frail girl who could barely lift her head from the pillow. Louise noticed, too. He would pause in his work, watching the sisters with quiet satisfaction. One crisp morning, he called Abby to join him outside. "Time you learned to check the trap line," he said, shouldering his gear. "Can't live on potatoes alone." Abby followed eagerly, her boots crunching through crusted snow. Luis showed her how to set snares in rabbit runs, his weathered hands demonstrating the proper knots. "Like this," he explained. "Loose enough to let them in, tight enough to hold fast." She proved a quick study, her determination showing in everything she tackled. When a fence post splintered in the cold, Louise taught her to brace and mend it. Her small hands grew calloused from the work, but she never complained. "My mother always said idle hands catch the devil's attention," she told Louis as they worked. Her laugh carried across the snow-covered yard. "Though I reckon she never meant for me to be mending fences." Inside the cabin, Abby passed on her own lessons to Louisa. "Watch now," she would say, showing her sister how to add just the right amount of sage to the rabbit stew. Too much burns the tongue, too little leaves it wanting. The kitchen filled with warmth and savory scents as Abby sang while she cooked. Her voice, strong and clear, transformed their simple tasks into moments of joy. Even Luis found himself humming along sometimes, though he claimed he had no ear for music. Evenings brought them together by the fire, where stories flowed as naturally as spring water. Luis would lean back in his chair, pipe unlit in his hands, and speak of his days in the high country. "Saw a grizzly once, big as a horse," he'd say, his eyes distant with memory, "standing in a stream fishing. Most magnificent thing I ever laid eyes on." Abby shared memories, too, mostly of her mother. "She had the sweetest laugh," she said one night, her voice soft with remembering. "Even when times were hard, and Lord knows they were plenty hard, she could find something to laugh about." Louisa listened to their stories, drawing pictures in her journal with the pencil Louise had brought her from town. Sometimes she would show them her sketches, mountain peaks, deer in the meadow, their cabin with smoke curling from the chimney. Trust grew between them like spring flowers pushing through snow. The wariness in Abby's eyes when she looked at Louise melted away, replaced by something warmer, something like belonging. One Sunday evening, as February's early darkness gathered outside their windows, Louise lit the oil lamp and cleared his throat. "Might be time for evening prayers," he said quietly. They gathered around the table, lamplight casting gentle shadows on their faces. Louis bowed his head, his voice rough with emotion. "Lord," he began, "I thank you for your mercy. When Sarah and little Mary died, I thought I would die alone in these mountains." He paused, drawing a shaky breath. "But you sent me daughters when I needed them most." Abby reached out and gripped his hand, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. Louisa leaned against her sister, adding her own quiet amen. The cabin had become more than shelter. It was home. The walls that had once echoed with Louisa's solitary footsteps now rang with Louisa's gentle humming and Abby's cooking songs. The scent of fresh cornbread cooling by the hearth mixed with pine smoke and coffee, creating the distinct aroma of family. Yet shadows lurked at the edges of their happiness. Word trickled up from town through passing traders. Rancher Turner was not done with them. He had been seen in the saloon, buying drinks for men who might support his cause, speaking of stolen property and rights. But for now, they chose to focus on their blessings. As Abby pulled a golden loaf of cornbread from the fire, its sweet aroma filling the cabin, Luis watched his newfound family with grateful eyes. Louisa set the table, humming one of her mother's old hymns, while Abby started another song about grace and deliverance. The cabin glowed with warmth against the winter night, a beacon of hope in the vast Colorado wilderness. Whatever storms gathered on the horizon, they would face them together, bound by something stronger than blood, the choice to be family. Frost sparkled on pine needles as Luis swung his axe, the sharp crack of splitting wood echoing through the crisp morning air. His breath rose in white puffs while he worked, adding to the growing woodpile that would keep the cabin warm. The sound of hoofbeats made him pause. Through the trees, Deputy Martin Briggs approached on his bay horse, badge glinting dully in the winter sun. Luis set his axe down slowly, noting how the deputy's gaze fixed on Abby and Louisa, who were hanging wash on the line behind the cabin. "Morning, Hale," Briggs called out, his voice carrying a hint of satisfaction that set Louis's teeth on edge. The deputy dismounted, boots crunching in the frozen snow. Abby drew closer to Louisa, both sisters watching with wary eyes as Briggs reached into his coat. He pulled out a folded paper, holding it like a weapon. "Rancher Turner's got legal papers here," Briggs announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Says those girls are his property by right of debt. You'll need to turn them over." Luis took the notice, his weathered face unreadable. Without even glancing at the words, he tore the paper cleanly in half. The sound cut through the morning stillness like another axe blow. "Get off my land," Luis said quietly, letting the torn pieces flutter to the snow. "And don't come darkening my trail again." The deputy's face flushed red, but his lips curled in a knowing smirk. "Law will have its say, Hale. Turner's got friends who remember how things ought to be." He swung back into his saddle, gathering the reins. "We'll be seeing you soon enough." They watched him ride away, his horse's hoofbeats fading into the forest. Only then did Luis notice Abby trembling beside him, her hands clenched into fists. "Easy now," Luis said, his voice steady and calm. "Paper don't make truth. Man can write anything he pleases, don't make it right in God's eyes." Dark clouds rolled in by afternoon, bringing with them the first flakes of new snow. Thunder rumbled in the distance, unusual for winter, as if heaven itself protested the morning's events. Inside the cabin, Abby stirred the stew pot mechanically, her thoughts clearly far away. The usual songs were absent from her lips. Even Louisa's gentle humming had fallen silent as thunder shook the window panes. They gathered around the table as evening drew in, snow falling harder outside. Luis bowed his head to say, "Grace," but Abby's voice stopped him. "It's my fault," she whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. "That day at the auction, when I begged them to buy Louisa instead of me, I brought this trouble on us all." Her shoulders shook. "If I'd just kept quiet." "No," Luis said firmly, reaching across to grasp her hand. "Mercy is never wrong, child. It costs, sure enough. Everything worth having does. But standing up for what's right, that's never a mistake." Louisa, still thin but stronger than she had been, touched her sister's arm. "I would be dead if not for you," she said softly. "That fever would have taken me if you hadn't spoken up. If Mr. Luis hadn't heard you." Thunder rolled again as Luis bowed his head. "Let us pray," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Lord, we thank you for bringing us together. Give us strength for whatever comes. Help us remember that your truth stands stronger than any man's paper." Abby and Louisa echoed his "Amen" as wind rattled the cabin's shutters. The storm outside grew fiercer, snow driving against the windows, but inside, the fire burned steady and warm. They ate their supper in thoughtful silence, each lost in private worries. The stew steamed in their bowls, and fresh bread sat warm on the table, reminders of the home they had built together. Every crack of thunder seemed to echo the storm brewing among men in the town below, but here in their cabin, they found strength in each other's presence. Louisa helped clear the table while Abby washed dishes, the familiar routine bringing comfort after the day's disruption. Luis added wood to the fire, its light casting long shadows on the walls. Outside, the winter storm raged on, but they were together, bound by something stronger than any legal paper, the choice to stand as family against whatever might come. A week passed quietly at the cabin. One crisp morning, Luis checked his rifle and saddled his horse for a supply run to town. The pantry needed flour, and winter still held the mountain in its grip. "I'll be back before sundown," he assured Abby and Louisa, who stood in the doorway. "Keep the door latched." Abby nodded, her dark eyes worried. "Be careful, Mr. Luis." The trail wound through patches of melting snow, quiet save for his horse's steady hoofbeats and the occasional cry of a winter bird. Luis kept alert, scanning the trees. Something felt wrong in the stillness. Suddenly, 4 men burst from behind the pines. Luis reached for his rifle, but a rope snaked around his shoulders, yanking him from the saddle. He hit the frozen ground hard as rancher Turner stepped into view, boots crunching in the snow. "Told you we'd settle this, Hale," Turner sneered. Luis fought back, landing solid blows, but the men overwhelmed him. Fists and boots rained down until he tasted blood. They bound his hands with rough rope that bit into his wrists. "Drag him to town," Turner ordered. "Sheriff's waiting." They hauled Luis along the trail, his boots scraping through slush and mud. His ribs ached with each breath, and blood trickled from a cut above his eye. His horse had bolted during the ambush, leaving tracks that led toward home. Back at the cabin, afternoon stretched into evening. Abby paced by the window, watching shadows lengthen across the yard. Luis had never been this late before. "Something's wrong," she murmured, stoking the fire. "He should have returned hours ago." Louisa huddled in Luis's old rocker, her thin shoulders wrapped in a quilt. "Maybe the store was busy?" she suggested, but fear threaded through her voice. "No," Abby said. "He wouldn't delay, not with night coming." They stayed close to the hearth as darkness crept in. Every creak of the cabin's timbers made them jump. Abby lit a candle, its flame casting wavering shadows on the log walls. In town, Luis stumbled as the men shoved him into the jailhouse. His face was bruised and swollen, dried blood dark on his shirt. Sheriff Wade looked up from his desk, tobacco juice staining his beard. "Well, look who finally decided to respect the law," the sheriff drawled. He stood, keys jingling. "Seems you've been harboring stolen property, Hale. That ain't right." Luis spat blood onto the wooden floor. "They're not property. They're children of God." "They're going back where they belong," Wade said, unlocking a cell. "You can sit here and think on your sins until Turner collects what's his." The iron door clanged shut. Luis gripped the bars, fighting down panic as he thought of the girls alone at the cabin. Through the jailhouse window, he watched Turner and his men mount up, their horses' hooves thundering down the muddy street. Night had fallen completely when Abby heard horses approaching. She grabbed Louisa's hand, pulling her away from the window. "Quick," she whispered, "behind the bed." But there was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. The cabin sat exposed on the mountainside, surrounded by darkness and winter bare trees. Hoofbeats grew louder, then stopped. Bootsteps creaked on the porch. Abby stood in front of Louisa, her spine straight, despite her terror. "I won't let them take us quiet," she promised, voice low and fierce. "Not after everything." The door handle turned slowly. Candlelight flickered across their faces as it swung open, revealing Turner's bulky shape against the night sky. Behind him, his men's shadows stretched long across the cabin floor. "Time to come home, girls," Turner said, his smile cold as mountain frost. Turner's men stormed into the cabin like wolves, their boots thundering across the wooden floor. Abby pushed Louisa behind her, backing away until they hit the wall beside the hearth. The candlelight caught the gleam of malice in Turner's eyes. "Grab them," Turner ordered. "And mind that older one. She's got fight in her." Two men lunged for Abby. She struck out, her nails raking across one man's face. He cursed, blood welling from the scratches. The second man seized her arms, twisting them behind her back. "Leave her alone!" Louisa screamed, her thin voice piercing the chaos. She tried to reach for her sister, but Turner caught her easily, his thick fingers digging into her shoulder. Abby thrashed against her captors. "Don't touch her! She's still weak from the fever." Turner's response was swift and brutal. His fist caught Abby across the temple, sending her world spinning into darkness. She slumped in her captor's grip, dimly aware of Louisa's sobs. "Please," Louisa begged, "have mercy." "She's all I have left." They dragged the sisters out into the bitter night. The wagon waited, its bed lined with dirty straw. Rough hands tossed them in like sacks of grain. Abby's head throbbed where Turner had struck her, but she forced herself to cradle Louisa close as the wagon lurched forward. The journey to town passed in a blur of pain and fear. Lanterns still burned in a few windows when they arrived, but most buildings stood dark against the star-filled sky. Turner directed his men toward Hammond's general store. "Got a nice secure storeroom in the back," he said, unlocking the door. "They can wait there till morning when we sort out the paperwork proper-like." The storeroom smelled of leather and coffee beans. Shelves towered around them, casting strange shadows in the lantern light. Turner shoved them inside, the key turning with a final click that echoed like judgment. Across the street, in the jailhouse's cold cell, Louis sat with his head bowed. Blood had dried on his face, and every breath sent daggers through his ribs. Then he heard it, Abby's voice, muffled but unmistakable, crying out in protest. His heart clenched. He gripped the iron bars until his knuckles went white, straining to hear more. The sounds of struggle faded, replaced by the hollow echo of boots on wooden floors. Luis sank to his knees. For the first time since losing his wife and daughter, tears tracked through the dirt and blood on his face. He began to pray, his voice rough with emotion and growing stronger with each word. "Lord, protect them as you protected Daniel. Give them strength like you gave David. Show your mighty hand, Father. Don't let evil triumph here." His prayer grew fiercer, echoing down the jailhouse hallway. The deputy shifted uncomfortably in his chair, unused to such raw faith. "Let your justice roll down like waters, Lord. Shield them from harm. Help me find a way to save them, or send someone who can—" In the storeroom, Abby pressed her ear to the wall. Through the layers of wood and distance, she caught fragments of Luis's prayer. Her heart steadied at the sound of his voice, so filled with conviction. "Listen," she whispered to Louisa, who huddled against her. "Mister, Luis is praying for us." Louisa's trembling eased slightly. "He won't give up on us, will he?" "No," Abby said firmly, "and we won't give up either. We just need to hold on until dawn." They found a corner where flour sacks made a softer seat than the wooden floor. Abby's head still pounded, but she forced herself to stay alert, listening to every sound from the street. Louisa curled against her side, humming softly, one of the hymns they'd sung around Luis's fireplace. Outside, the town grew quiet. The saloon's lamps dimmed one by one. leaving only stars to pierce the darkness. In their prison of coffee beans and saddle leather, the sisters huddled closer. Every creak of the building's timbers made them flinch. Every shadow seemed to hold threat. "What if they separate us?" Louisa whispered, her voice small with fear. Abby tightened her arms around her sister. "They won't. I won't let them." But her own heart raced with each passing hour. She thought of Luis in his cell, still praying. She thought of their mother, who had taught them to sing in times of trouble. Softly, barely above a breath, she began one of those old songs. Louisa joined in, their voices twining together in the darkness. They sang to keep fear at bay, but terror gripped every breath between the verses. Dawn felt years away, and morning might bring worse than darkness. Yet they sang on, clinging to hope, while across the street, Louisa's prayers continued to echo through the night. Dawn broke over the town with needles of sleet rattling against window panes. The icy pellets coated the muddy street in a treacherous glaze, reflecting the gray morning light. Inside the jail, Luis lifted his bruised face toward the small window, his prayers never ceasing through the long night. The door creaked open, bringing a blast of cold air and the sound of boots on floorboards. Reverend Mitchell stepped into the cell block, his Bible clutched tight against his black coat. The deputy started to object, but the preacher's stern look silenced him. "I must speak with the prisoner," Reverend Mitchell said firmly. "It's my Christian duty." Luis's voice was rough from hours of prayer, but his words carried clearly through the cell. "These girls aren't property, Reverend. They're free souls, made in God's image same as any of us." The preacher nodded slowly, studying Luis's battered face. "I heard what happened at the auction. You paid honest silver for their freedom." "More than the asking price," Luis confirmed. "But that ain't even the heart of it. You can't own people. It ain't right before God or man." Across town, widow Margaret Whitfield stood at her window, watching sleet coat her garden. Her morning quiet was broken by her neighbor's boy, rushing up with news of Luis's beating and the sisters' capture. The widow's weathered face hardened as she heard the tale. "Sarah Hale would never forgive me if I stood idle now," she muttered, naming Luis's late wife. She grabbed her shawl and strode toward town, her boots crunching through the icy crust. The widow burst into the sheriff's office, her voice sharp as a whip. "Sheriff Matthews, you're a coward to let this happen. Those girls were legally freed. I demand you convene Judge Parker immediately." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Now, Margaret." "Don't you Margaret me," she snapped. "I've known this town 40 years. I know forgery when I see it, and I know cowardice too." Her words struck home. By noon, the town buzzed with word that Judge Parker would examine Turner's claims. The courthouse filled quickly, townsfolk pressing shoulder to shoulder in the cramped space. 2 deputies led Abby and Louisa in from Hammond's store. Despite their night in the cold room, Abby walked tall, her chin lifted. Louisa stayed close to her sister's side, but her eyes showed more anger than fear now. Turner lounged against the judge's rail, a smirk playing at his lips as he watched the sisters enter. Abby met his gaze steadily, refusing to look away. Her defiance made his smile falter. The door opened again, and Luis was hauled in, chains rattling at his wrists. His face was a mass of bruises, but his eyes were clear and calm. He nodded slightly to the sisters, drawing strength from their courage. Judge Parker settled behind his desk, adjusting his spectacles as Turner presented his papers with a flourish. "As you can see, Your Honor, these here documents prove my rightful claim." The widow pushed through the crowd, Reverend Mitchell at her side. "Let me see those papers," she demanded, reaching for the documents. Turner tried to snatch them back, but the judge handed them over. Margaret studied them carefully, her lips pressing into a thin line. "This is Charlotte Webb's signature," she declared, pointing to a line. "Except Charlotte Webb died 2 years before this date. I helped lay her out myself." Reverend Mitchell leaned in, adjusting his own glasses. And this notary mark, it's missing the territorial seal. Every legal paper must have it. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Turner's face darkened with rage. You're both lying. I've kept the church records for 15 years, the Reverend said firmly. I know when Charlotte Webb died, and I know forgery when I see it. The room erupted. Voices shouted over each other as Turner lunged for the papers. The sheriff grabbed his arm, finally forced to take action. Judge Parker pounded his gavel, demanding order. These documents are obvious forgeries, the judge declared, once quiet fell. Mr. Turner, you'll be held for questioning about this fraud. Deputies, remove his handcuffs from Mr. Hale immediately. Luis rubbed his wrists as the chains fell away. Abby and Louisa rushed to him, tears streaming down their faces. The widow and Reverend moved to stand beside them, a wall of protection against Turner's furious glare as the sheriff led him away. The law is clear, Judge Parker continued. Mr. Hale paid fair price for these sisters' freedom. Any papers claiming otherwise are hereby nullified. This court recognizes them as free persons under the law. Judge Parker's gavel cracked against the wooden block like thunder. Silence in this court. The crowd's angry murmurs died away, leaving only the soft patter of sleet against the courthouse windows. Turner shifted his weight from boot to boot, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill. The judge peered at him over wire-rimmed spectacles. Mr. Turner, explain how you came by these documents. Well, Your Honor, Turner tugged at his collar. They was given to me proper, through legal channels. Which channels exactly? The judge's voice was sharp as a knife. Turner's explanation wandered, full of vague references to men who couldn't be found and dates that didn't align. His words tangled worse with each question, like a man caught in his own rope. Widow Whitfield stepped forward, her gray hair neat beneath her bonnet. From her reticule, she drew out a stack of yellowed papers. Your Honor, I have here records of Mr. Turner's previous dealings, 3 separate occasions where he presented forged documents to claim property that wasn't his. The papers rustled as they passed from hand to hand. Turner's face grew red as summer beef. That old woman's lying. These are county records, the widow said calmly. Each one shows the same pattern. Documents appearing suddenly, signatures that don't match, dates that impossible, just like today. Reverend Mitchell rose slowly from his bench. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice carried clear and strong through the packed courtroom. Your Honor, if I may speak? The judge nodded. The preacher's words fell like stones in still water. We gather here each Sunday to worship a God who teaches that all souls are precious in His sight. No man can truly own another. We can only seek to redeem each other through love and mercy. He turned to face the crowd. What Mr. Hale did at that auction wasn't buying property. It was an act of redemption. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Faces that had sneered now looked troubled. The deputy shuffled his feet, no longer meeting anyone's eyes. Luis stood straight despite his chains, his bruised face dignified in the pale light filtering through the windows. Your Honor, he said, lifting his shackled hands, I never aimed to own these girls. I paid that money to buy their freedom, nothing more. His quiet words carried to every corner of the room. They're as free as any soul here. Gasps scattered through the crowd like startled birds. Even the sheriff looked away, his face flushed with shame. Judge Parker studied the documents before him, his expression grave. The sleet tapped against the windows, marking long minutes of silence. Finally, he looked up, his eyes hard as flint. Having examined these so-called proof of ownership, I find them to be clear forgeries. His voice filled the courtroom. Furthermore, Mr. Turner's documented history of similar frauds leaves no doubt as to their origin. The judge's gavel rose. I hereby declare these papers null and void. Mr. Hale's purchase at public auction was lawful and binding, not as a transfer of property, but as an act of manumission. The gavel fell with decisive force. "Sheriff, release Mr. Hale immediately." The sheriff hesitated, looking at Turner, but the judge's stern glare left no room for debate. With reluctant hands, the sheriff unlocked Luis's shackles. Abby rushed forward the moment Luis was free, supporting him as he swayed slightly on his feet. Louisa pressed against his other side, tears streaming down her face as she clutched his arm. The sister's touch seemed to strengthen him, and he stood straighter, drawing them close. The crowd watched in uneasy silence. Where there had been mockery and hatred, now uncertainty showed in their faces. Some looked away, unable to meet the family's eyes. Others watched with dawning understanding as truth worked its quiet revolution in their hearts. Turner stormed toward the door, his boot heels striking the floorboards like gunshots. The sheriff moved to follow, but Judge Parker's voice stopped him. "Sheriff Matthews, escort Mr. Turner to a cell. He'll be held pending investigation of these forgeries." The widow and Reverend Mitchell moved to stand beside Luis and the sisters, their presence a shield against lingering hostile stares. Through the courthouse windows, weak sunlight finally broke through the clouds, touching Abby's face as she helped Luis down the aisle. Her chin was high, and though tears shone in her eyes, they were tears of relief, not fear. Louisa walked close to her sister, her thin fingers still gripping Luis's sleeve, as if afraid he might disappear. But for the first time since the auction block, her shoulders were straight, unbowed by terror. The courtroom watched them go, hostile jeers replaced by thoughtful silence. Truth had turned the tide, washing away lies that had seemed solid as stone. In its wake, something new began to take root. The first tender shoots of understanding, breaking through hard ground like spring grass after winter. Snow drifted from pearl-gray skies, each flake catching the late afternoon light as it settled on the courthouse steps. The crowd that spilled out into the street spoke in hushed tones, their earlier hostility replaced by something closer to shame. Many could not meet the eyes of Luis or the sisters as they emerged into the peaceful silence of falling snow. Luis's bruised face showed weariness, but his steps were steady as he made his way down the courthouse steps. At the bottom, he paused. The sisters stood close beside him, Abby's arm still supporting his elbow, Louisa pressed against his other side. The widow and Reverend Mitchell waited nearby, their presence a quiet shield against any lingering ill will. With deliberate care, Luis lowered himself to one knee in the gathering snow. He looked up at Abby and Louisa, his weathered face gentle in the fading light. "You heard the judge," he said softly. "You're free now, truly free. No man can claim otherwise." He drew a slow breath, his voice rough with emotion. "That means you can choose your own path forward. If you wish to make your way elsewhere, I'll see you have means to travel safely." Abby's fingers tightened on his arm. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but her voice was strong and clear. "We don't want to go anywhere else." She glanced at Louisa, who nodded fiercely. "You saved us when no one else would. You've shown us nothing but kindness and respect." Her voice broke slightly. "We want to stay, not as property, but as family." Louisa stepped closer, her thin face glowing with conviction despite her weakness. "You saved my life," she said simply. "When I was burning with fever, you stayed up all night, you and Abby both." She reached for Louisa's hand. "You're the only father I've ever known who acted like one." Louisa's eyes brimmed with tears. His broad shoulders shook as he gathered both sisters close. "Then if you'll have me as your father," he whispered hoarsely, "I'll be proud to call you daughters." The Reverend Mitchell stepped forward, his Bible clutched in his hands. He bowed his head over the three figures kneeling in the snow. "Lord," he prayed, his voice carrying in the hushed street, "we witness here today not a transfer of property, but the forming of a family. Bless this father and these daughters. Let their bond, freely chosen in love, be a lesson to us all. Amen." the widow whispered, and others in the crowd echoed softly. The townsfolk began to disperse, moving away in small groups. Their faces were thoughtful, some showing traces of tears. A few nodded respectfully to Luis as they passed. The deputy slunk away toward the saloon, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Turner, under the sheriff's watch, was led back toward the jail. His face was dark with rage and humiliation, but he said nothing as he passed. The clang of the cell door echoed faintly from inside the jailhouse. Luis rose slowly to his feet, drawing both sisters up with him. The widow stepped forward, pressing a basket into Abby's hands. "Some fresh bread and preserves," she said warmly, "for your journey home." "Much obliged, ma'am," Abby replied, her smile bright despite her tears. Luis's wagon waited at the hitching post, the mule stamping patiently in the growing dusk. He helped Louisa up onto the seat, then Abby, before climbing up himself. The widow tucked a thick quilt around their legs, while the Reverend Mitchell laid a gentle hand on Luis's shoulder. "You've shown us all what real courage looks like," the preacher said quietly. "Your door will always be welcome at our church." Luis nodded, too moved for words. He gathered the reins, and the wagon creaked into motion. Snow continued to fall in the growing darkness, muffling the sound of wheels and hoofbeats. As they passed the small church on the edge of town, its bell began to toll the evening hour. The clear notes rang out across the snow-hushed valley, speaking of peace and freedom. Abby closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. Louisa hummed softly along with the bell's song. Ahead, through the curtain of snow, a warm glow beckoned, lamplight from their cabin window, promising shelter and home. Luis guided the mule steadily toward that light, his daughters pressed close on either side. The bell's last note faded across the white-draped hills, but its echo lived on in their hearts, ringing with the sound of chains broken and family found. The wagon rolled on through the deepening night, carrying its precious cargo toward home, not as master and property, but as father and daughters, bound by choice and love rather than paper and coin. The snow fell softly around them, covering the old tracks and marking their new path forward together. The cabin's warmth embraced them as they stepped through the door, shaking snow from their coats. Luis winced slightly as he hung his jacket, his bruises still tender from the ambush, but his eyes were bright with contentment. The familiar scent of rabbit stew simmered on the iron stove, filling the small space with its rich aroma. "Let me tend the fire," Abby insisted, already moving to add another log. The flames leaped higher, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Luis eased himself into his favorite chair by the hearth, the old wood creaking welcomingly beneath him. Louisa settled cross-legged on the floor nearby, her fingers working carefully on the half-finished pine whistle Luis had started teaching her to carve before everything happened. Her thin face showed deep concentration as she smoothed the wood with gentle strokes, just as he had shown her. "That's right," Luis encouraged, watching her technique. "Mind the grain of the wood?" The quiet was comfortable, broken only by the pop and crackle of burning pine and the soft scraping of Louisa's knife against wood. Abby stirred the stew, then paused by the bookshelf, her hand hovering over a worn leather spine. "I found your Bible earlier," she said softly, drawing the book from its resting place. Dust motes danced in the lamplight as she opened it carefully. "Would you mind if I read some?" Luis's voice was thick with emotion. "Please do." Abby settled into the second chair, the firelight catching the tears that still sparkled in her eyes. Her voice grew stronger as she read, the familiar words of Psalm 23 filling the cabin with their ancient comfort. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Louisa's humming joined the words naturally, a sweet harmony that made Luis close his eyes in gratitude. The whistle in her hands was nearly finished now, smooth and promising music of its own. When Abby finished reading, Luis straightened in his chair. "Time for supper," he said. "But first." He held out his weathered hands. Without hesitation, both sisters moved to kneel beside his chair. His strong fingers rested gently on their shoulders as they bowed their heads. "Thank you, Lord," Abby whispered into the quietness, her voice trembling with emotion, "for sending us a father." Luis's breath caught. "And thank you," he managed hoarsely, "for sending me daughters." Tears rolled freely down his cheeks now, but his smile was radiant in the firelight. After the prayer, they gathered around the table. The stew steamed in their bowls, and fresh bread from the widow's basket filled the air with its yeasty warmth. Louisa set her finished whistle carefully aside, beaming with pride at her accomplishment. Their laughter came easier now, rising to fill corners that had known only silence for too long. They shared the bread and stew, passing the salt back and forth, each movement natural as if they had done this forever instead of mere weeks. Outside, snow continued to fall in the darkness, erasing old tracks and softening rough edges. The cabin glowed like an ember in the vast night, its lamplight spilling through frost-edged windows in welcome squares of gold. Though they knew the town's whispers would not fade quickly, within these walls they had found something stronger than prejudice, a family forged in mercy, bound by choice and love. The lamp burned late into the night, its steady flame a beacon of hope against the wild frontier darkness, just as their faith had become a light against the shadows of fear and hate. Luis watched his daughters clearing the supper dishes together, their movements in easy harmony, and felt his heart might burst with gratitude. The Lord had turned his loneliness to joy, his empty house to home, and given him a family he never dreamed possible, but now couldn't imagine living without. If this story made you pause, reflect, or even smile, don't forget to subscribe. I post daily, and the next story might be exactly what you need to hear.